In this video, I'll show you how to set up Next.js with a database, both in a development environment as well as in a production environment, including using Docker. And the company behind Docker is actually today's sponsor. So I'll show you the typical workflow. All right, let's start with setting up a development environment. So just as an example, I have a very simple application here. It's just one page, and I also have this server action. Let's take a look at the page here, right? So just an H1 at the top, which is what I have right here. I've hard-coded some tasks, and here we are mapping over them, right? That's what we see here, task 1 and 2. And then below there, we have a very basic form, right? That's what we see right here. This form, when you submit it, will invoke a server action. And right now it's not doing much, just logging, right? So nothing fancy going on here yet. Right now the data is just hard-coded here. We're gonna add a database in a second. Now for Next.js itself, I'm just running this locally here with npm run dev, right? Which is actually this script that's gonna run next dev. I have not Dockerized this app right now, and this is typically how I would run a Next.js app in development. Now when we go to production, we may decide to Dockerize the Next.js app and host it as a Docker container essentially, and I actually have a separate video on that. But you may actually also want to run Next.js locally in a Docker container. So I will quickly show you how you could Dockerize Next.js. We're not going to do it locally here, but I just quickly want to give you an example in like 2 minutes. So when you want to Dockerize your Next.js application, you need to create some Docker files, and actually Docker, the company behind Docker, actually is sponsoring this video. They need to get the word out on some new features that a lot of people actually don't know about. So we could manually create Docker file, right? New file. I could create a Docker file manually, but I also want a Docker ignore file. I want a compose file. So actually we can just use the Docker init command, right? So if we do this, it will actually guide us through a setup. So actually Next.js is just a Node.js app. So you can see that's what it detects here. Now I find it a bit easier to just pick other here, and it will create 4 files that we don't have to create manually. So now what I get here, I get Docker ignore, compose, Docker file, as well as a readme. So if I open up this Docker file, and then I can just replace that with a more simple one, just for this example. And from this, I can create a so-called Docker image. I can use Docker compose. Let's actually use Docker compose. So here I can just describe my services. Right now, we're just going to create one app here. It can build it from the Docker file in the current directory. We will give it a name. We're going to use port 3000 on both sides and just setting an environment variable. So now I can run Docker compose up, and it will build that image and automatically create a container and run that container for us. All right, so eventually we see the familiar Next.js logging. So now I can try going to localhost 3000. I'm going to refresh. You can see it's compiling that. And now I am indeed viewing this app that's actually running in that Docker container. This is the only shell I have open here, so I'm not cheating here. Now I like using Docker desktop, very nice interface to manage everything here. So here I can see all the images. So this is the image that we just created from our Next.js application. So you can see it's pretty big because it contains everything that's necessary to run that app. And then to actually run an image, you create a so-called container. And so this is the one that's actually running, and that's the one that we're actually using here. And so you can see how much CPU and memory it takes up. All right, now if you're running this and you actually update something here, so if I just add a bunch of S's here, if I save here, you can see it does not immediately update here. So we want that hot reload that we are used to when it's running in the Docker container as well. And we can actually do that. A lot of developers don't know that. So we can add the following to our compose file. This will synchronize our file system with the file system inside the container. All right, so now we can run Docker compose up again, but now with the watch flag. So now if I run this and we go to our page, and here I just need to make a change again. If I save here, and I do need to go here again. So if I just load the page here just so it can get started, you can see now it's updated. If I now add some more S's, if I save here, you can see it automatically will update now. We have sort of like a hot reload feature, even though we're using Docker. So I think that's pretty cool. All right, so this was just a quick example of how you can Dockerize a Next.js app locally. And just to show you 1 or 2 more things here that are also quite new. So here in the Docker desktop app, you can see when I open up this Docker Scout tab here, it will actually automatically start to scan the image I built from my app for vulnerability. So here I can actually see that there are some, well, medium severity vulnerabilities, and I can view here to see which ones those are. There appears to be an issue with this layer. Right, so Docker Scout is also a feature that you get for free actually. Works with local images as well as remote images. So if you're pushing the image to Docker Hub, you can also scan it on there. And I actually did another video on Dockerizing Next.js and actually deploying it to a VPS. So basically using Docker in production. I would say that's more common for Next.js. Although technically, like we just saw, it's possible to also run this Next.js app up in a Docker container in development, but it's not as common. So for this example, I will not Dockerize Next.js locally here, but still good to know it's possible. And if you actually do want to deploy it to production, you should definitely consider using Docker, especially if you're already a little bit more familiar with Docker. So for now, we're just going to use Docker here locally for the database actually. So we're going to use Postgres here because we're also going to use Postgres in production. We're going to deploy to Vercel. Vercel has a new Postgres database offering, and it's nice if you can have the same type of database, of course, in production as well as in development. Now, to get a Postgres database running locally, it's actually very easy to do this with Docker. So here is actually a good use case for using Docker during development. I'm going to use a standard image here for Postgres. I'm using version 15 of Postgres because that's also the version that Vercel is using as of recording, so that you have the same version in both prod and development. We don't need to set many environment variables. Only this one is actually mandatory for this image. I can give it any password I want. I just call it example. This is the password that other containers, if you were using other containers, would need to use to connect to the database. And then we're just specifying these ports. So this is an official Docker image, and it actually has pretty good documentation here. So they show you exactly how to use this with Docker Compose and also which environment variables to set. So actually you only need to set Postgres password. So now if I open up my terminal again and let's try running Docker Compose up again, let's see if this, so it's gonna pull that image, it's gonna pull that from Docker Hub, and you can see it says ready to accept connection. So if I open up my Docker desktop again, you can see I have another entry here. It's actually this one. It says 3 months ago because I've been playing around with this a little bit before. This is the old one that we were using before. I can just delete this. First need to delete the containers, and then here let me delete this. So now we have this Postgres image. We can run this and it will actually run a database. So now what we want to do, of course, is in our application we want to add some data to the database, right? So here I was hard coding just an array of tasks, right? So we want to put those tasks in the database and then read from there, and then also add data to there, right? So read and write. So how do we do that? How do we connect our Next.js app? How do we connect that to a Postgres database running in a Docker container? So I like using Prisma as my ORM. It will help us connect to the database, but also perform queries and migrations, as we'll talk about. So they have a quick startup guide. I'm just gonna follow the instructions here. So Prisma itself, we're gonna save it as a dev dependency, and then we can initialize it. So we can say npx prisma initialized or init. All right, so it will do a couple of things. It will create a so-called schema. If I now go up here, you can see I have another folder here called Prisma, and it has created a schema.prisma here. And you can see by default, actually, it will try to connect to a Postgres database, and it needs to know the connection string. It's going to look for that in an environment variable called database URL. So what Prisma by default also does is create a .env file. And here it will create like a dummy environment variable. So Prisma will use this string to connect to our database that's running in that Docker container. So this needs to be a specific format. So here, this is correct. Now here we have a username and password. We have a password here as the environment variable, but not a user. So by default, in that case, the user will just be Postgres, and I will just use example as the password then. And then here we can give a name for our database. So here I will just call that dev database. So the first time Prisma will connect it, it will create a database like that. All right, so now we could connect to our database, but let's actually first specify the schema of the database, what we would like the schema of the database to be. And we do that in schema.prisma, right? So here's where we specify our desired schema of our database. So in this example, I'm using a model, and each task just has an ID and a title and these two. So this is my desired schema of the database. That doesn't mean that the database that's running in that container already has that schema, right? This is just specifying it for Prisma. So now I want to use Prisma to actually make that database have this particular schema. So I can do that with npx prisma db push. So let's see what happens if we do this. And it says we cannot reach the database server. So let's double check that our database server is actually running. And you can see I don't have a running container here. So you can see status is unused. So we just need to run Docker Compose again. Docker Compose up. All right. So now you can see database system is ready to accept connection. So now we can instruct Prisma to connect to our database and actually update it to have the schema that we want. So there are actually two ways to do that. We'll talk a little bit more about migrations, but Prisma actually recommends that during development, as you're quickly prototyping things, that you use db push. So now you can see your database is in sync with your Prisma schema. How do we know that? How can we check that? Well, Prisma also has a studio feature, so we can inspect the database. So you can see here, it will show all the models in the database. You can see it has created that task model in the database, but it's currently empty. So what we want to do, of course, is when we add a task here, that our Next.js app through Prisma can actually insert it into that Postgres database running in that Docker container. So let me close everything here and let me open up that page. All right, so here I just hard coded this. Let's actually remove this and see if we can get that from our database. How would that look like? So Prisma also has a Prisma client, right? So here here I can, and so I can do something like this. So the name of the model and then find many will give me all of the tasks in the database. So we get a red squiggly line here because we haven't set up Prisma client yet. So the Prisma client is something else. So the Prisma client is something that you may need to install separately as well. So it's Prisma/client. So I can install that. And then they also show you how to set it up in Next.js, because you don't want to create a Prisma client instance each time you're performing some query, right? You only want to instantiate it once and just reuse that throughout your application. So I like to create a lib folder and I call that db.ts, and I can just paste that right here. We don't need to know exactly what's going on here. We just need to make sure that we're using this Prisma variable now when we make these queries or when we update the database. So you can see I'm importing it from here. Now if I save here and if I refresh here, let's see what we get. Okay, so of course I do need to run my Next.js app. Let's see if I can squeeze it in here. Okay, we'll say npm run dev, right? Just running it directly on my computer. All right, so now we have this. It's empty because we have no tasks in the database, right? 0. I can close this. All right, so let's actually add something, and let's do it here in our Next.js app as well, because we have a form here, and this form is using a server action, right? So here, that server action, here we will get the form data, and instead of logging this, we want to update that. Here we can say wait.task.create. We need to make sure we also import that here, right? So pretty innovative. We don't need to create a separate API route handler. We can just have basically just a function and add use server, and Next.js will make sure that the form data is actually submitted to our backend, where we can then insert it into our database. So I'm going to say test here. I'm going to click on add task, and you can see we actually, if I refresh now in our database, we have one item now in our database. If I add another one, test 2, if I click on add task, now I just clicked and you can see it's not updating the view immediately, but if I go to the database, it has been properly inserted. So if you also want to re-render essentially the page with the latest data, we have revalidate path in Next.js. So if I save here, and now you can see it actually already edited, but now if I try test 3, press enter, you can see it gives us the updated view after updating the database. So now we are reading the data from that Postgres instance running in that Docker container, and we are also writing data to there, right? So I would say this is a pretty solid development setup. We run our Next.js application directly, and then we have that Postgres database in a Docker container. Now, if you run into issues with that Docker container, there's actually a really cool new feature as well that not many people know about. If I squeeze in one more terminal here, let's see. All right, let me make it a little bit wider here. So with Docker PS here, I can see all the containers that are running. We just have one here. Now, if you have an issue with one of them, so in this case, if the database isn't responding or there is some other issue, in the past, what you may have tried is to do something like execute and then that container ID, and then you maybe try to spin up like a bash. Now, if I do that here, it will work, but it won't work for every container because not every container has that available like that. So Docker actually has a better way these days. It's called Docker debug, and then here we can specify the ID of the container, and you can see here we get something special here, right? So here you can see Docker debug, and here we get sort of like a shell inside the container. So here I can do ls, and you can see the files, and in here you can do things like ping, localhost. So here you can see I am actually getting a response. You can do other things as well, like curl and use vim. I can change the directory, even with autocomplete. So if you're a little bit familiar with Docker already, maybe you didn't know about this. So this is maybe a better way of going inside the Docker container essentially and seeing what's wrong. So let me exit out of here, because for us right here, everything is working properly, but that's good to know. So this is our development environment. And so now let's talk about a production environment. So we want our Next.js app as well as our database in production. This would be a more common situation where you want to Dockerize your Next.js app and actually push it to a VPS, let's say. So I have a separate video on that as I just showed you. Here we're just going to deploy to Vercel, because Vercel also has a Postgres database offering, and it will just make it a bit easier for us for this production environment setup. So in the dashboard, you'll see all of the projects. I have one from a previous tutorial, but these days they also have a storage tab here where you can actually create a Postgres database. So I'm going to, on a free plan, you get one for free. So I will just quickly spin one up. I would say this is DB prod, right? And the region by default is going to be Washington, DC. It's the same for your serverless functions actually. So that's nice that your backend Next.js app and the database are going to be in the same region. You can see under the hood, they're actually using Neon, and you can actually also use Neon database directly, but here we'll do it through Vercel. So I'm going to create this one. All right. So very quickly right now, after 1 second, it shows us our database here essentially and ways to connect to it. So here we are using Prisma. It will help you out with that as well. Now here for the environment variables, you need to set a couple of them. Now what we don't want to do is set this here, right? Because if we set it right now, if we set it here, that would be used locally as well. You want to be very careful with that, because if you actually use these, you will connect to your production database locally, right? That's not what we want to do, right? So here we just want to stick to what we have here. These environment variables, we're just going to set here in the Vercel dashboard so that our Next.js app in production will use them. To make that work, we need to push our project, our Next.js app, to Vercel as well. So we're going to create a new repo here on GitHub. I'm just going to call it my Next.js app, and I'll just make it private. All right, then I'll quickly create this here. Okay, so then we just need to push our app to GitHub. Make sure you pay attention to the environment variables that you're using. Next.js sometimes talks about .env.local, which is where they recommend you actually keep secret. Here I'm using .env. If I don't want to commit this to my repo, I do need to make sure I actually ignore this here. I will just add it here just to be safe. Now you can see it's grayed out now. If after adding git ignore it's not grayed out, it may be that the file was already being tracked. So you may want to just simply delete the git repository and just start from scratch, or just delete that, or you want to get more granular, that's up to you. But for me now it's grayed out. So now I can actually push this to GitHub. So let's just quickly copy this. I can do all of that in one go, paste that right here. Now if I refresh, all right, so now my app is right here. Now I can go to Vercel, add a new project. Here I can say my Next.js app. Okay, now we're gonna run into an issue, but let me just show you that. Let's just go through it here. Okay, so now it's gonna pull my repo from GitHub and it will try to build it. So it's gonna run a Vercel build. That may take some time, and actually after some time we can see there's an error. So you can see here it's trying to run npm run build. Okay, so everything seems to work, and then there is an issue here with Prisma. So if you're using Prisma, the way it works here, the way that we've been using it is with this Prisma client. It's coming from Prisma client. Now this is generated for us when we run npx prisma db push, or as we'll talk about migrate. The reason it's generating it after you change your schema, it needs to get a new type, right? So here it wants to give us autocomplete here. So the Prisma client knows there is a task in our schema, because every time we change our schema, we're gonna run this command which will update the Prisma client so it can give us autocomplete. So the Prisma client needs to be generated, and locally that happens sort of automatically as we run this command. Now in production, when you run npm run build, that's not going to happen automatically. So here we can specify that during the build it needs to generate that, and then it can actually build the Next.js app. So we just have to push to GitHub again. I'm gonna commit and just push it again. Now let's take a look here. I can go to my project here and I can see the deployments. It should automatically pick up on my push there, so it should automatically try again. Yeah, so it's gonna try it again. Let's take a look. All right, another error, actually as expected as well, because we're not quite finished here with the database. Okay, so here it cannot find the database URL environment variable. So locally we used the .env file here, so it was just getting it from here. Now here, where is the string for Prisma to connect to our database? We created a database, if you remember storage here. If I go to storage here, you can see I have a database, but we haven't connected the actual project yet. So let's actually connect our project to that database. So then Next.js will actually automatically set the environment variables as well. So now you can see we have our storage tab here. Now if I go to settings, environment variables, all of them are automatically set for me by Vercel because I connected the project to that database. So if we go to deployments here, let's actually just redeploy here. All right, third time's the charm. And actually no, so we have another silly issue, I think, with the name of the variable. It still can't find it because the environment variable is called, well, let's take a look, settings, environment variables. So these are automatically set for us. It's actually called Postgres URL. So when Prisma is trying to connect here in schema.prisma, it's trying to read database URL. So let's actually rename this to Postgres URL, and let's also do that here locally. So I will just call it Postgres URL here as well. Then let's push this and let's see what happens. Fourth time, when you're deploying to production with a database, you're usually gonna have a couple of errors. All right, another error. All right, so here if I open this up a little bit, yeah, so here you can see, and actually this will be the last one error probably, because you can see it already got pretty far. It's just generating the pages. So what happened here, it cannot find the table task. So what happened here is it's generating the pages. So during that build, it's generating this page and it's trying to run prisma.task.findMany. So it's trying to go into the production database. All right, let me actually open that up. So it's trying to go into the production database and trying to find a table called tasks. So here in the storage, here is my database. Here I can browse my database. You can see if I click here, there are no tables yet. So as it's trying to do this in production with the production database, there is no task table yet, right? So the core of the problem here is that our production database does not have the correct schema, right? So we in Prisma have described what we would like the database schema to be. We do that in a file called schema.prisma. This is our Prisma schema, but that's not the actual database schema yet. Now we could technically do something like db push here as well as we build, but it's not really recommended. So what we want to do actually is work with the Prisma migrations to properly solve this issue, right? So if we go to our development environment here, as we prototype our app, we make changes, right? So over time, this schema here, it's not set in stone. And in the beginning, it's very fluid, right? So as you play around, you will think, oh, maybe I should add a completed field here. And now our database, our local database should be updated, right? So locally, you're first going to make a lot of changes. And every time you make a change, you need to run npx prisma db push, right? Or at least that's the option you have. This is the quick and dirty way of quickly updating the database to conform to your schema here. And now you're like, you know what, never mind, right? So in the early stages, you're prototyping. So you're quickly changing things. And so every time you would do npx prisma db push, sometimes you need to delete data. And so over time, you're going to make a lot of those changes. Now, eventually in development, you kind of know what you want. You can get a little bit more rigid. So at this point, you want to keep track of the changes you make to your database. So Prisma allows you to keep track of that history. It's called a migration history. So as you change your database, that's a migration essentially. Prisma can automatically keep track of that for you with the migration history. So what we can say is npx prisma migrate, and this is for development, and we can even give it a name. So we can say this is just the first one essentially, just to initialize this. Let's just see what we get if we do this. So now you can see it's actually very similar to db push. It's going to reset here. All data will be lost. Okay. And now you can see it's very similar to db push, and it also generated at Prisma client, but the difference is now we have this migrations folder here, which will keep track of all of those changes that we make here, which is beneficial because as we make changes to our database, we can use that history of migrations to also update the other databases that we may have in our setup, like a production database, maybe your team members, right? So I actually have a great guide on this. Highly recommend you check it out. Right, so now I have this one migration here. It's actually just a SQL file with instructions of how to update the database. Now we want our production database to look the same as what we have here, right? So our production database needs to apply these migrations, so it will have the correct schema. So we want our database in production to apply that. So how do we do that? Well, here we just need to add one more. So it needs to, we just add Prisma migrate deploy. So deploy here is meant for your CI/CD pipeline. In this case, we just have one production database. This will take that history of migrations and apply it to the database it's connected to. In Vercel, that will be the production database. All right, so now let's do this one more time. Git status, git add, git push origin main. Let's see what we get. Let's see what we get. All right, now finally we see a green light here. So let's actually check it out. Okay, so let's check it out. All right, so here my task. So initially the production database is going to be empty, and we can see that, by the way, here in the dashboard as well. If I refresh our database here, I can browse my database. You can see it actually has two tables now, tasks, and actually Prisma will create a migrations table as well. We don't need to worry about that, but you can see now this is working. If I say test here, if I add task, you can see it's also updated immediately. If I refresh, the data is persistent, right? So this is now our production environment, and I can inspect my database right here. We still have a local environment here, and I can inspect my database with Prisma Studio. And so what you would do now is during development, you would make update, and after every update in your schema, you would do a dev migration, and it will keep track of all the migrations, and then you push to production. And during that production build on Vercel, in this case, with this command, the migration instructions will be applied to your production database as well. Right, so that's a little bit of setup. You know how to use Next.js with Postgres and also Docker, both in development as well as in production. I want to thank Docker for sponsoring this video. Make sure you check out their latest offerings. They actually have a lot of cool things going on, including the Docker Scout we take a look at. There's much more to explore. You could, of course, also host Next.js in a Docker container in production, and I have a separate video on that. But hopefully this video helps you out to quickly spin up a local and a production environment, and I hope to see you in the next one.